everybody. Welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here. Finally, it looks like COVID 19 is behind us. Not that it is if you look at what the fear mongering experts continue to say, but by just looking around. Most people are not wearing masks, for example. Uptake on the boosters is pretty low all across the country, and it feels like people just want to move on. Now, having said that, there are a lot of unanswered questions about the way that all levels of government, but especially the federal and provincial governments, handle the pandemic. Everything from all but putting a gun to your head to get vaccinated, to repeated lockdowns, mask mandates, and social distancing measures. And we couldn't meet our friends and family over the holidays. There was a restriction on our mobility. And in places like Quebec, even nighttime curfews, something we associate more with tin pot dictatorships than a free society like Canada. A lot of people are looking for accountability, which we've not yet had from any of our elected officials. My guest today wants to change all of that. He's a very distinguished Canadian with a stellar record of public service, none less than Preston Manning, whose influence in shaping the present Conservative Party is incalculable. Mr. Manning has continued to be in public life, and most recently, he's called for a citizens' inquiry into the pandemic to figure out what was done right, what was done wrong, and where do we go from here in the event of future pandemics or other emergencies which are sure to occur at some point in the future. So Preston Manning, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for taking the time. I would love to learn more about your motivation in calling for this citizens' inquiry into the pandemic. Could you tell us what the citizens' inquiry is? What would be involved? How are the commissioners going to be picked? Who will testify? So basically, in other words, what are the nuts and bolts of how the citizens' inquiry will work, and what exactly are you hoping to accomplish?
Okay, now there's about 8 questions here. I'll start with the first one. I guess, like what this is a project to establish a national, independent, citizen-led inquiry, public inquiry into what went right, what went wrong, and what lessons can be learned from the COVID-19 experience.
Mhm.
And a couple of the motivations behind it. One is I personally keep hearing from a large number of people saying there should be some kind of inquiry into this thing. And we actually set up a website, this National Citizens Inquiry.ca, where people can go to it and indicate, do you want this type of an inquiry? And so far, there's been about 20,000 people that have said yes, they want an inquiry. A second thing is that earlier this or last month or mid-October, we had a survey was done, a public opinion survey was done, in which 74% of Canadians said they were hurt by one or the other of the health protection measures, which is a pretty serious number. This isn't hurt by COVID,
Yeah.
and the statistics on that, and there were people that were seriously hurt by that.
Mhm.
These were people saying they were hurt by the health protection measures in 4 categories. Either their health was
Okay.
hurt in some other way, or they felt their rights and freedoms were infringed, or there was a social harm, particularly from the social distancing, and then the harms to the economy from the lockdowns.
Mhm.
So those are 2 pretty important reasons, I think, to have this kind of inquiry, and to have it citizen led. There's so much suspicion out there, and there'll be suspicion about this too, that if the governments were to have a inquiry, it would be them investigating themselves, which would an awful lot of people be skeptical about that.
So this was a survey that was conducted by the citizens. Who conducted the survey, Preston?
It was done by one of the pollsters. It's actually on this website. It was done
Okay.
by one of the pollsters that does these regular
Okay.
polls every month, and
Okay.
we talked him into tacking a couple of questions about this COVID thing onto that survey. So it was a sample of 1,500, 1,600 people, but quite that's a fairly interesting statistic, and it
Right.
varied a bit across the country depending on what region you were in.
Right. And did one of the questions address vaccine injuries by any chance?
Not specifically. The two
Okay.
questions, what one was, were of these four
Mhm.
harm categories,
Okay.
which one affected you and your family
Hmm.
most seriously?
Hmm.
And the social impacts came up
Okay.
highest on that one, with
Right.
the health and economic impacts almost equal, just slightly less. Then the second question was, which of these harm categories do you think affected the largest number of people? Which one affected the
Hmm.
country as a whole, as distinct from you and your family? And the economic harms came up on the top of that list. So those were the two questions, and those are the answers. And there's a bit of a breakdown by region and by gender that people can take a look at.
Okay. So could you tell us why you're pushing for a citizens inquiry and not an official government inquiry? One downside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in one sense, the
Yeah.
mechanism for having public inquiries, there's the Public Inquiries Act, the federal one, and there's a number of provincial statutes,
Yeah.
Inquiries Act. But the suspicion there is, if the government holds it under that the
Mm.
government really controls this investigating itself. And there's so much skepticism about that the credibility of that would be challenged.
Right.
If the government does it, the suspicion is it's a whitewash. If the opposition parties gang up and say we're going to have it,
Hmm.
then the suspicion is, well, it's a political witch hunt. So the idea was to endeavor to have this citizen led. And
Hmm.
one of the if people visit this website, the one thing they're asked, do you support this idea? Register here. But
Yeah.
the second question they're asked is, who would you trust to conduct this? We have to get commissioners for this independent inquiry, and
Yeah.
we're asking people, who would you trust to conduct this inquiry? And so far,
Hmm.
this is just very early, so it's a little too early to tell what people think
Yeah.
in large numbers. But there seem to be two lines of thought on that. Some people say you need somebody that's very objective, like a retired judge, someone that's distant from, hasn't been
Hmm.
connected with the government or with the interest groups or whatever. You want objectivity, sort of judicial objectivity. Other people say, but you're going to have expertise on that
Hmm.
panel. There have to be a medical person. There should be a civil liberties person. There should be an economist, whatever. Typical of, when you ask Canadians, do you
Hmm.
want this or that? Why can't we do both? And probably what'll come out is that maybe the chief commissioner should be this arm's length, objective kind of person, but have others on that panel. The idea is to have five commissioners, have
Right.
the others represent more expertise.
Yeah.
And the intent is to get people to testify at this economy as to at this inquiry as to the
Yeah.
impacts on themselves.
Hmm.
And people that are going to testify are told two things. One is, you'll testify under oath. There'll
Okay.
be a commissioner of oaths there that asks you to affirm that what you're saying is true and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, which is a
Hmm.
good addition. And secondly, you'll be subject to cross-examination by someone who's probably pretty knowledgeable about this.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
attempt to, that's the framework for the inquiry.
Yeah. I mean, one downside of a citizens' inquiry is that any conclusion the commissioners reach in the report would not have any teeth and not binding. But then, to be fair, as we know, for example, the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act, which is ongoing now, it's an official inquiry mandated by law, but it also has no teeth. So, I mean, there's been some criticism by some academics and some from some quarters that the citizens' inquiry that you envisage is biased towards those who are opposed to government mandates around vaccination, and more generally, they make the claim that it will be divisive and polarizing in an area which is already proved to be pretty polarizing. How do you respond to such criticisms?
Well, a couple of things. First of all,
Yeah,
we say to someone like that, why don't you go and testify then and say exactly that?
yeah,
Why don't you go and present your side, that you think the other group is providing misinformation or prejudice? But you
hmm,
understand, you will be asked to affirm what you
yeah,
are saying is the truth, the whole
hmm,
truth, and nothing but the truth. It's not
hmm,
embellished with a whole bunch of other things. And you will be subject to cross-examination. So
yeah,
if you want balance there, why don't you go and provide it? Second thing we say is we'll do everything we can to make it as objective as possible. And rather than prejudge the thing, prejudge is like prejudice that comes from the same root. Rather
Yeah.
than prejudge this and saying, oh, it's not going to work, it's going to be biased, et cetera, et cetera. Why don't we wait and do it and
Yeah.
then make a judgment as to whether it was objective or not? And then the third thing I say, we'll do everything we can to make it objective. It will at least be as objective as the CBC. It'll
Yeah.
be as objective as the editorial page of the Toronto Star, and it
Yeah.
will be as objective and ideology-free as your
Mhm.
Department of Political Science at the university. These are the
Mhm.
great models of objectivity to
Yeah.
which we will aspire.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to chat with you about was, our Westminster parliamentary system is notable for its lack of accountability, especially when a government has a majority in parliament or a de facto majority, as we have right now with the NDP supporting the Liberals. As and I've talked about this with other guests on the show, Canada has an incredible deference by the judiciary to the government, much more so, say, in the US. For example, key parts of Biden's mandates on the pandemic were shredded by the courts. Nothing like this has happened in Canada. And when a government doesn't have to face voters for another 4 years and they can just hope that everything just disappears, what kind of accountability do we really have in our system? I suppose your citizens' inquiry is one way of getting that accountability, although it's going to be non-binding. My question really is, do we need more checks and balances, and how would we get them in our system where the Prime Minister is all-powerful?
Well, that's a huge question. In a way, it's beyond this COVID thing. But
Yeah.
with respect to this citizen inquiry, it can come up with recommendations. If it was a royal commission, that could come up with
Okay.
recommendations too. But there's no way that you can bind the government to implement the
Yeah.
recommendations of a royal commission, other than you create enough public support that
Yeah.
says that recommendation should be followed. And that kind of public interest and support can be generated just as much by the citizens one as by
Mm-hmm.
a royal commission. And I think the intent of this is the ultimate intent is to be positive, to say, okay, listen to all the things that went right, the things that went wrong. But at the end of the day, and in fact, if I was one of those commissioners, the last question I would ask of any witness, no matter what they've said, is, okay, you've related your experience, your perspective. What could be done different?
Yeah.
What would you recommend so that the next time there's a national crisis, it's better managed? And so hopefully the recommendations that come out of this are a list of things that could be done.
Mm-hmm.
And you're endeavoring to get enough public support to have moral suasion to get those things implemented. And as a federal election comes along, one of the questions then will be, how was this COVID thing managed? Here's a bunch of recommendations. Do you or do you not support these recommendations?
Mm-hmm. What's been the general reaction to the citizens' inquiry, especially the political reaction, if any?
Well, there's been a lot of people go to this website and say yes, they want it, which is really what prompted this in the first place. The credibility is a rest on three things, probably the number of people that say yes, we want it, yes, we want it. The credibility of these commissioners, are they people that folks have confidence in? And the third will be that the testimony that's actually given at these hearings, that'll add to the credibility. And so far, there's been an increasing amount of interest in it. Our next challenge is actually to identify these commissioners, and we're asking more and more people to go, who would you trust? Who would you trust? Give us the names. Try and investigate them.
Yeah. Do you know of any other countries that have come up with this kind of inquiry?
Well, I believe, I haven't followed it closely. I think in Australia there was a senator that this was more in the political arena. There was a senator that organized an inquiry, sort of like this. Now, of course, he was an elected person, so it had the
Right.
political flavor. I think it was an independent senator, but it had the
Hmm.
political flavor to it. And what
Hmm.
we've said to the political, we're not asking the political people to take a position on this. I mean, people have,
Yeah.
I believe there was a liberal backbencher actually introduced a private members bill saying the government should have this.
Hmm.
We haven't tried to talk them one way or the other. In fact, we've said, why don't you let this happen and see if it is of
Yeah.
benefit, you know?
Hmm. Stepping from the citizens' inquiry, if you were to take stock of where we are in Canada right now, would you say that we have now become a much more polarized society? You have on the one hand these gungo enthusiasts on vaccines and other restrictions, and those who are critical of them, and also what looks like a resurgence of a major geographical divide between Western Canada and Central Canada. To my mind, all of these point to signs of trouble going forward. Where do you think we stand? Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Yeah, I'm concerned about this
Yeah,
polarization. I mean, it's very
yeah,
pronounced in the United States, and we'll
yeah,
probably see how that affects
yeah.
the elections. But I worry about this polarization, and the democratic process and democratic institutions are supposed to be able to handle that.
Yeah,
That people with differing views are have freedom of speech to argue for their position. They ought to be arguing it in an elected assembly where people are accountable for what they hear and what they do. And then that assembly comes to some kind of a conclusion, often trying to find the common ground between those polarized opinions. And the fact that we seem to have lost that ability, and the contempt that the government shows for the parliament, the prime minister shows up less and less. You can hardly physically get to the
yeah,
facility in Ottawa there.
yeah.
So I think this illustrates a problem right across the Western world with the
Mhm.
democratic processes, democratic institutions, and people have to decide whether those need to be renewed in some fundamental way, or else you're going to have this the conflict that this continual polarization creates.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of that going on. I mean, especially here in Canada, and of course, the pandemic hasn't helped with respect to that. You've been involved in the political evolution of Canada, and especially of the conservative movement. And today's Conservative Party is very different from the last progressive conservative government of Brian Mulroney, and arguably even different from the last conservative government of Stephen Harper. Where do you think the conservative movement, and by that I mean small c, is today, and where is it going? There's always been this impression in Canada that Canada is liberal, small l, leaning, and it's borne out by the fact that we've had way more liberal governments than conservative governments, at least in our recent history. Do you think that'll ever change?
Well, yeah, right now you have more conservative provincial governments than you
Mm-hmm.
do liberal governments. No, I think I've been involved in the evolution of the current
Yeah.
conservative party, and I think it's headed in the right direction. I've known Pierre Poilievre since he was a teenager. He
Mm-hmm.
was on my board actually in Calgary Southwest as a teenager. He had political interests way back there, and I think he'll make a constructive contribution. I think it's important for people in different parts of the country to understand the politics of the other. Uh,
Yeah.
you cannot understand Quebec politics without understanding nationalism, soft nationalism, hard nationalism. You cannot understand the politics of Western Canada without understanding populism. Populism is to the political culture of Western Canada what soft
Mm-hmm.
nationalism is to Quebec. If
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that soft nationalism is legitimate, in the case of Quebec, no matter how you deal with it,
Mm-hmm.
it ought to be legitimate to recognize the populist roots of the current Conservative Party coming from the West.
Yeah.
But I think I say I'm a a conservative ideologically, but I say almost more importantly that I'm a small d Democrat first and foremost.
Yeah.
And I think there are small d Democrats in all the parties. And the small d Democrats better be concerned about this deterioration of democratic institutions and democratic process, because the whole thing rests on that foundation. That foundation goes. It doesn't much matter whether you're liberal, conservative, or socialist, or whatever.
Yeah.
If democracy's in trouble, then we're all in trouble.
Yeah. Finally, Preston, are you optimistic that values of individual liberty, which have taken a battering in the last 2.5 years or so, and conservatism may become the dominant ideology in Canada moving forward?
Well, I think the rights and freedoms are under threat. The ones that are supposedly
Yeah.
guaranteed by the charter, but existed long
Hmm.
before the
Hmm.
charter, and Canadians should be alarmed about that. If
Hmm.
they're not alarmed by it, if rights and freedoms can be limited in the way they have been in the COVID crisis, or for other reasons, then I think democracy itself is in trouble. One of the worrisome things about that survey that I mentioned to you, I mentioned
Yeah.
the four categories.
Hmm.
The harms, did you experience harms to your health, your harms social well-being, your economic well-being, or harms to your rights and freedoms? The one that was mentioned the least was the harms to rights and freedoms, which is,
Extraordinary.
in fact, only 11% said that was the one that worried them the most with respect to their personal and family life, and an even lower percentage said that was the one that was most worrisome on a national basis. And what that illustrates to you, and I've talked to
Yeah.
some of the lawyers on
Yeah.
this, they say people do not see the connection between
Yeah.
losing your rights and freedoms and it having an effect on your health, losing your rights and freedoms and having effect on your social well-being,
Yeah.
having losing your rights and freedoms and having an economic effect. The mandate
Yeah.
aspect of all of those caused those harms, but it got its legitimacy or illegitimacy from the attitude toward rights and freedoms. So I think what that illustrates is that a lot of work has to be done to stress the importance of conserving those rights and freedoms, particularly when they're under pressure through a crisis like the COVID-19.
Right, and you cannot discount the power of fear and paranoia, which was very much prevalent during the 2 years and continues to be so, actually.
Yeah,
And
and you wonder, like with
yeah,
November 11th coming along in Calgary,
yeah.
there's this field of crosses where they have a cross for every
Hmm.
soldier that died in the First and Second World War, and
Hmm.
it's a sobering thing. There's this huge
Hmm.
field along Memorial Drive there, just thousands and thousands and thousands of people that sacrificed their lives, and for what? They,
For our
they
freedoms.
attached them. Yes, yes, and for us to ignore that or to be
Yeah,
cavalier about it or say, well, it's not relevant today. That I think that's a huge mistake.
yeah. And how do we fix that? How do we change that? How do we
Well, I
get
guess
people to be more concerned about losing their rights and freedoms?
Well, I think a part of it is in the education system, but the
Mm.
education system doesn't seem to attach a great deal of importance to that either. So by education, I mean more the education at home, parents
Yeah.
themselves telling the
Hmm.
children
Hmm.
of the importance of these things, and getting more people in the political arena that are prepared to advance and defend those freedoms in the public arena.
Right. Well, on that note, Preston, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I really appreciate you joining me on the show. It's been a real privilege and pleasure to have you on the show, and I hope we can speak again soon.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed
Thank
it
you.
too.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.